Susannah, Nathan, welcome to the All Things Risk podcast. It's a pleasure to have you both on.
Thanks for having
Yeah,
us.
thank you.
I loved your book. I love the whole concept of the upside of uncertainty, and I think we're going to have a great conversation. Before we do that, it would be wonderful if you could give us a little bit of your background, who you are, what you do, all that good stuff.
Great. So I'm a professor of strategy and innovation. I did my PhD at Stanford after working in industry for a couple of years. And now I really study how does innovation happen? How do we do new things? And this project is kind of an outgrowth of that. And I teach at a university in France, in Paris.
And I'm Susannah Furr. So I am basically an entrepreneur and kind of dabbler in lots of different things. Currently I'm working on learning about the soil and how we need to heal our soil to grow like the most nutrient rich food. But that is not my background. I studied art history and have a master's in that. So I just love art and meaning, and I love uncertainty.
And you created a clothing line. And
I did.
By the way, we're married. We've been married 25 years. So, yeah.
Congratulations. So
No,
this is our
I don't
first,
Okay, sorry.
sorry, apologies. It's the first husband-wife combo we've had. So another first.
And it's our first joint project. For many years, we studied together, we met at college, but then we kind of diversified. So this is our first joint book, and we love doing it. So it was an uncertainty we took on. Will it work? Will it be fun? Will it be engaging and rewarding? And it was. So we're having a ball.
Yeah, and I think, Susannah, I'm kind of like the nerd who studies this because it's hard for me, but I see how important it is. And Susannah, being, the entrepreneur, is kind of the one who has, a lot of times has a lot of courage to step into the unknown, to embrace the uncertainty. So I think it's kind of the combination of study and living.
And you're calling us from France.
Yeah, so we live in Paris, France. We've lived here for 7 years. Obviously, you can tell from our accent, we're not originally from France. We both grew up on the west coast of the U.S., met in university. We have four kids. They're university age for the most part. And we've managed to make it through and be really great friends and collaborators. So,
Fantastic. So let's get into the upside of uncertainty. Where did the idea for this book come from?
Well, maybe I'll jump in first. So I've been studying innovation for 20 plus years, and I've had the chance to interview many innovators, some of them big names, like a Jeff Bezos or an Indra Nooyi, and many others that maybe aren't kind of household names, but who have done really fascinating things. And the thing that struck me about that is that to create anything new, we all admire the new things. We all admire the breakthroughs. We admire the entrepreneurs, the innovators, the creators, the designers, the scientists. But in every single case, to do that new thing, they had to first face uncertainty. That was part and parcel of it. It was like the change, the possibility, the creation was one side of the coin, and the other side of the coin was taking the risk, going into the unknown, having the courage to try something different. And I would say that's actually a principle that's true in all of our lives, that if we reflect on the thing we are proud of, the things we are proud of, maybe it's a career move, maybe it's a relationship, maybe it's a geography change, whatever it is you're proud of, maybe it was going to school, that all came after embracing some uncertainty. So as I mentioned, I struggle with this. So I was really fascinated by the question, could we get better at it? And of course, being an academic, I went out and found, there were several literatures that talked about this, work in topics such as ambiguity, tolerance, and uncertainty avoidance and resilience. And what was very clear from that work is, yes, individuals can learn, but what was missing was the how. And so this project was really trying to go back to the limited available empirical research, but also lots and lots of interviews with these very different types of people, not just entrepreneurs and innovators, but creators, designers, paramedics, all kinds of folks, to understand what do they do that helps them to embrace that uncertainty.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, wonderful. I love that. And Susannah, it would be great to get your perspective as well. I guess Nathan comes at it from an academic or a studied perspective, but you sound like you come at it from a slightly different perspective.
Yeah, so I think for me, the upside of uncertainty was really this feeling that I really am more curious about the how and how to help people see it, because it is something that's more intuitive for me. And a few people have asked why or how, and it doesn't really make sense. I'm a very middle kid peacemaker in my family. I really love control too. I'm someone that loves to get systems going, and raising my kids, I always was, masterminding stuff. But I think intuitively, I have felt so empowered whenever I saw a portal to take a risk and go for something. So I really got excited about joining Nathan on this project when it became clear to me that I had some ideas and experience that I could lend. And I also really nudged the book to start asking different types of people, not just the business world, not just entrepreneurs, but artists and creative types that do other things, and even volunteers or people that are doing stuff that doesn't totally make sense. I'm curious about uncertainty when it leads people to do things that that don't compute, like in Wendell Berry's poem. Because I think that's when that's when the evolution and the transilience we talk about in the book, that leaping from one state to another, that's when uncertainty is worth it. Like doing a new thing just because it shaves off time or efficiency, that's cool. But we talk about the uncertainty we love that really changes the world for the better, is those risks that lead us to a whole new way of thinking. It could be so many different things.
Maybe explain transilience.
Yeah. So transilience is a word from, I guess, the technology strategy field, but it's describing leaping from one state to another. And so beyond resilience, because a lot of times resilience is you're on a path and there's some obstacle or hardship and you get knocked down, and it's being able to get up and continue. And for us, transilience resilience we love, clearly that's something we all need, but transilience is beyond that, because you take the punch and you get up, but maybe you are able to actually shift to something entirely different. So your framework might change. And it's really a reframing moment, because you might be feeling like, I cannot do this thing, or I don't even see a way out. And transilience would be in an instant. And it can happen this way, where you are doing this thing that as 5 seconds ago you were sure was not possible. Mm-hmm. And so it's like a quantum. To me, it's something beautiful about our universe that can happen. And we really are wanting to encourage people to look for those moments where they are leaping from the uncertainty to that other possibility that's just on the other side.
I have to add, when you ask where does this come from, and Susannah's contribution, there's a little dirty secret to this as well. And that is, when the project started a decade ago, it was really more about the uncertainty we choose. Say, like when you start a new venture or a new project, or you do something new, you chose to do that thing. And then while we were working on it, the COVID-19 pandemic hit, and it became like abundantly clear, like personally, deeply, painfully relevant, that uncertainty happens to us too. We don't always choose it. It hits us sideways. And I think one of Susannah's great contributions was to really push and to say, at that point we were collaborating on it, but she said, if you can't use these tools to help yourself in this moment, because for me, all of my income comes from teaching and speaking, and that disappeared in a week. It was like gone, the entire slate just eradicated. And we have kids in university and mortgage payment and all this. So I was freaking out. And she said, if you can't use these tools to help yourself, I will not let you write this book. It would be too dishonest. It would be too kind of academic in the armchair. You have to have skin in the game here. And I think that was another really important contribution she made, was to push me to use the tools even more in a new way that I hadn't.
Right. Yeah. And it really does come through, I think, in a lot of the tools and things that you talk about. But before we dive into a few of those, I actually just want to talk a bit about the just uncertainty as a concept, as a topic, and why do we seem to dislike it so much. And I work in the corporate space, and everything is about engendering certainty in processes, in outcomes. If we say that we're going to hit these numbers by the end of the quarter, we sure as hell better do that. And we're also, as adults, we tend to, I think when we're children, we like to play, and play is about uncertainty, I think, and just doing something for the sake of it and seeing what happens. We kind of lose that as adults, and we tend to just codify or try to codify certainty. And I'm just curious if you could talk a little bit about the concept of uncertainty and why we find it so frightening and difficult.
I think this is a better answer for me.
Okay, sure. So, I guess we can think about it at two levels, because you mentioned corporations. So there's organizations and there's individuals, right? And so at an individual level, it's very clear from the neuroscience studies, so when we look at images of human brains, that we are wired to be afraid of uncertainty. That's an evolutionary response, and it kind of makes sense in a world, say, 100,000 years ago, where, there really wasn't much benefit to going 100 miles from where you were. There was really mostly kind of risk. And so over, many, many thousands of years, we were wired to be afraid of that. And you have to consider what's changed. What's changed is we don't live in an environment anymore where any number of random things are going to kill us. Instead, we have kind of made a safe environment, and we've made an environment in which technology has created so many possibilities, and human interactions create so many possibilities. We actually live in this environment, incredibly rich possibility. And so there's actually an immense benefit to actually venturing outside of the known territory. So we have this evolutionary response that is mismatched to our current environment. And if you never need any kind of evidence on that, if we look at the end of people's lives, what are the things they regret? They regret not taking more risks. That's what they regret. And they regret not spending more time with the people they love. Those are the things they regret. But now, that's like an individual level response. We have this kind of old evolutionary wiring. And the organization, I totally hear you, because I spend a lot of time with executives, and they always talk about how do we reduce the risk? How do we eliminate the risk? All that kind of thing. And that comes from the nature of organization. So you can go back and all the organization theorists, and the purpose of organizations as originally defined was to create repeatable machines so you could capture value. The fundamental flaw in that whole paradigm is that a repeatable machine to capture value is not good at creating new sources of value. Now, our environment in which we live, again, has become much more dynamic, much more uncertain. We can look at, for example, the World Uncertainty Index created by some economists at Stanford and the IMF is just one little kind of indicator. And the uncertainty has been an upward march for decades. What that means is maybe our pattern of organization is ill fit for the current environment. And as evidence of that, go look in the startup world. And the startup world has not only exploded and entrepreneurship exploded, but the way they even define what an organization is, they define a startup as a temporary organization in search of value. So think of that as different from a repeatable machine trying to capture value. And so the challenge that organizations have today is they're starting to realize, like no risk, no growth, no opportunities, because if there was a risk-free growth opportunity, everybody would just go grab it. Like, why wouldn't you do that? And so there's this adjunct professor at Columbia that we interviewed who said it really interesting. He said, uncertainty is the moat that protects an entrepreneur, and uncertainty is the moat that protects an opportunity. And so, again, back to that two sides of the same coin. And so I think organizations are having to really go through this, and I would predict over the next decade or two, this existential crisis about who are we, how are we organized, how do we operate. We can acknowledge that some parts of the organization need to be a repeatable machine. But if we don't have the capacity to embrace some uncertainty, in other areas, we won't create anything new. And I have many examples of established organizations that are learning that.
Also, it's interesting in how you describe that certainty is also a myth, right? We tend to attach ourselves to things, whether it's a past that never really existed that we kind of romanticize, or when things would go back to, quote unquote normal, as if normal was, a thing that was great and even existed. And I suppose it's perhaps a bit of a security blanket for our minds that there are these things that are normal, and we shouldn't venture too far away from the harbor if we're in a boat. But all of that is a story, right, that we create. So I wonder if you could just expand on the fact that this concept of, look, we live in uncertainty, and so we need to get better at it. And as an adjunct kind of question to that is, why don't we get taught some of the skills that are in your book when we're growing up?
That's one of the great mysteries. I'll let Susannah respond to some of this, but I will say, like, the motivation of the book, in a way, it was my advisor at Stanford used to say, you study the thing that you're kind of obsessed about. And for me, that was it. It was like, I could see clearly we live in this environment of uncertainty. And I could also see clearly that there was so much opportunity for people who were willing to step into the unknown. But I just hadn't been taught any of those skills or capabilities. In school, we're taught, we're put in little rows and, alphabetical order, and we're taught to plan our lives, and that we can, plan for what career you want and then go execute on that. And like, let's be honest, like, how many of us executed on that plan? Nobody. Like, I've changed so many times. I was talking to my son, I was saying, oh my gosh, let me tell you about all the times I failed. Like everything I tried didn't work. And that was this beautiful pivotal moment where I changed direction. And now I'm so grateful I did that. And let me tell you about how many times I changed careers and topics, and I'm not like some abnormal creature. Like, life is fundamentally uncertain and will change on us. And so why is it that we're not taught these skills to deal with that kind of world is one of the great puzzles to me.
Yeah. So this idea of certainty, I think one thing that's fun to think about is, I think part of the reason we like it so much is really it does feel good. Like, I also love tradition. So I love making traditions with my family. I love thinking through what would be meaningful. And so on two sides, I love uncertainty and I love tradition. And I think what we need to do is come to this place where we realize there's a middle place, or maybe there's a good recipe where you're letting yourself have both. Because, and we talk about this in the book, uncertainty needs balancers. And it's a tool that you can prime yourself for uncertainty by making sure you have some of these traditions or these touch points that you can count on, where you are going to soothe that creature, that need for comfort and coziness, and coming back to, like, sustain yourself and refuel so that you can go and venture back out and take the adventures. And actually, this son that Nathan was talking to about all the change, I mean, that kid as a little boy in kindergarten rode his bike home in the middle of the day, not on the right time schedule. And he, luckily I was at home. I was about to do errands, and he shows up, and he was on his bike looking over at me like as if he was on a Harley. He's looking across at me, and he goes, I open the door, I'm like, Georgie, why are you here? And he goes, they're turning me into a slave. And he could feel that his preschool, which was at Stanford, had been this amazing, it's in the top of the world because it's doing all these really glorious, there's chickens on site, they can play in water, mud, they're constructing things, they're cooking in the kitchen. It's a dream world. And this kindergarten all of a sudden was worksheets, like, now is recess for 5 seconds and then get back in here and work hard. And the reality, I think what's so interesting about this child is, in that mode as his mother, I was like, oh my gosh, he's in kindergarten. We've got to get him to figure this out. He's got to figure in his world. And he's an artist. Today, I think back, if I could have had more of a sense of uncertainty and the benefits of really trusting, like, what was certain for this child is he needed something different. And we didn't really have the resources or the options. Even we were in the Bay Area, there were great schools. We tried to get him into other stuff. We weren't chosen. We didn't have the money we needed a scholarship. But I guess I go into this long thing to say, I think when our world wakes up to the beauty inherent in letting certainty, just letting it run through our fingers a little bit, and just trusting that something that we don't understand yet or don't even have access to would be better. And we have to build it sometimes. We have to construct it. It would have been better if I could homeschool him. because he kind of stayed in a system that has caused a lot of stress and sadness. And I think there's a lot of kids out there, and luckily we are having charter schools and all these things now. And all of that was risk, all of that was uncertain, and it still is. But certainty is overrated. However, we need it. We need it for the comforting times.
Yeah.
We just need a mix.
I just want to riff what you're saying, Suze, because it's really so important that, you know, some folks who are listening might be being like, oh my gosh, I have way too much uncertainty in my life. What are you talking about? And I just want to reassure you, you're right. Like, in other words, a lot of times we need to bring down the heat. We got to create those balancers of some certainty in our life. But on the other hand, there is this duality that certainty is an illusion. And I love the way that this recent contemporary philosopher put it, John O'Donoghue. He said in a really beautiful way, he said, the things we see as facts in our lives are just one of many, many possibilities, maybe even 1,000 possible ways things could have gone that just happened to get elected as a fact. And when he put it that way, it kind of gives this kind of beautiful kind of transparency or just chanceness to what we think of as fact. And it feels like you could kind of push through, because you say, well, if that just happened to happen, it was just one of many possibilities. And the future also has many, many possibilities, more than we might think. And that, I think it's really important for when we feel really stuck, is to remember that kind of very kind of, kind of almost semi concrete nature of reality, and that it's very uncertain, but that's because it's so many possibilities. So if we can see it in terms of possibilities, then it feels less stressful.
Yeah, that's great. I'd like to dive into some of that, but I also think it's really important, Susannah, what you mentioned about having rituals and routines and some things to anchor ourselves around. I think what we get tripped up is when we don't really recognize the difference between having some of those foundations in our lives and then the kind of need or the comfort for, I don't know, turn by turn instructions on everything, which would make life like really boring, right? Like if we were told, oh, now do this and now do that. And that's where I think there's a point at which people kind of trip themselves up over, well, this is not, there is no turn by turn instruction here. And there's no certainty that if I do this, I'll get that, or, you know, this kind of thing. Or if I did, then how boring would that be?
Yeah. Yeah. You're so right. And I think that's one of, human instincts aren't, there's a huge field of behavioral economics that highlights how sometimes our human instincts lead us astray. And one of the most dangerous is this predilection for certainty, which because we're wired to feel afraid of it. And because we live in a society that often praises stability and certainty, we can kind of end up creating these lives that are full of certainty and are extremely boring. And one of my favorite interviews was with the head of a very large gambling organization who said, oh yeah, we totally recognize that. In fact, between us, we call what we do reverse insurance, which is for people whose lives have become so certain, we actually offer them the possibility that something new could happen. And they'll pay for that, so just as a little illustration of that.
And I guess you don't have to, sort of mortgage your house to go to Vegas or something to get that experience. But I really like this. Maybe we could just dive into some of your some of the concepts and reverse insurance. But I also like the idea of experiments, right? Like if you could just try, like you don't know what's going to happen if you try something, which I think is tapping into that sort of reverse insurance. And if we knew the outcome, we would either do it or not do it, or it'd be done already, right? Which is the whole. I think there's a whole sort of kind of Zen koan thing about startups, right? That if there's a map for this, then this new venture would exist already. This new idea would exist already, and so we're just going to explore to see if there's a possibility here, and if not, as you talk about pivots as well, and that I think that whole concept is where a lot of life happens, a lot of excitement happens, right? A lot of why we are here happens.
I guess I was going to say, to just kind of frame it up for people, like we discovered in the Upside of Uncertainty, we wrote about over 30 tools for like navigating this stuff. And that's a lot. And so to help people make sense of it, we tried to organize it. And we took this metaphor, actually it was Susannah's idea, for kind of a first aid cross for uncertainty. It's this universal symbol of aid. And it has 4 arms, or 4 categories of things to pay attention to. The first is reframing, this idea that we're wired to fear uncertainty. So how do we reframe in terms of the possibilities so that we don't feel as much anxiety? The second is priming, which, think about how you prime a wall to paint it so the paint sticks, or you prime an engine so that it works, or pumps, so it pumps water. It's this kind of things we can do to prepare so that when uncertainty happens to us, we're calmer. The third is do. One of the best ways to resolve uncertainty is to take action. But there are ways to take action. Actually, some really interesting empirical research that highlight how that we can have a greater probability of a positive outcome by using certain ways of taking action. And then the last is to sustain, and that is to acknowledge that if you go into uncertainty, something's going to go wrong. You're going to have a setback. And so, how do you sustain yourself? That's really important.
Yeah, I'd like to just touch on maybe a few of them just to give people a flavor for what some of these tools look like, and maybe we could start with, I mean, we talked a little bit at the reframing of uncertainty, but I'm just wondering if you could, one of the ones I really like is this idea of infinite game that you talk about. Could you tell us a little bit more about what you mean by infinite game?
Sure. So infinite game, we took that idea from James Cars, who the late professor of NYU, who was a philosopher and even theology professor, but he loved this idea of life as a game, and that there are 2 ways to play, that you're finite, which means that you're meant to win, that it's a competitive journey and it's all lined out of how to do it well, or an infinite game, which is everything is up to question, because instead of trying to win, you're there to keep the game in play. And at that moment, your rules and roles and boundaries and purpose of why you're playing shifts dramatically, because when you're not focused on winning, all of a sudden it's like, well, wait, what are we doing? Oh, we're here to enjoy this. We're here to make it better, to improve, to collaborate. And so basically the infinite game reframe is so important, because in uncertainty, one of the worst feelings is that if we're looking at our situation as a finite player, our brains are just wired with this panic of like, am I the fastest? Am I doing it? Oh my gosh, they're overtaking me. My idea is getting scooped. My money's running out. I'm gonna not survive. And so having an infinite frame when you face uncertainty, all of a sudden you're just more relaxed. You're like, whoa, there's not one way to do this. First off, I don't have to win. I don't have to do the role like it's been described to me. I don't even have to, maybe, if my purpose is not to win, but maybe more to do it for the love of this thing, or to do it because it's important, or it's my duty. There's a lot of different ways we could look at this from, as a parent, or as a manager, or as a in a partnership. When we have this infinite frame, it actually gets to be more fun. It sinks into this place, like in a physical way, that you feel just tangibly different. And I can imagine, this is a thing for me, it's very natural for me, actually, the infinite role. So to explain to someone who is more finite in nature, who's like, because let's face it, sometimes finite players can go their whole life and do it, and they keep winning, and it works for them. And so it can be hard to be like, why would I do this differently? I'm winning. Like, kids that always score the best on the test and have these moments, it can be really like fun because it's working and they're always winning. But, if you look at the research by Carol Dweck, who did the growth mindset, she talked about how devastating it is for those individuals when it's come to them so naturally and easily, in a moment where they get thrown off and they didn't win. It is a crushing blow. And I have a nephew like this who did everything. It came so easily. It was like he could just not even study and get the best thing. And he was the speech and debate champ. And he was just so talented and gifted in all these ways that he hadn't really worked for. And the minute things went hard for him, it was just really a tragic thing of like, something's wrong with me. I've lost my golden touch. So a finite player is still in danger of having some kind of really debilitating issues if an uncertainty hits them sideways and they weren't prepared.
So
Yeah.
here's a fun example. So we were just, since we live in Paris, we're really lucky. We get to see the end of the Tour de France.
Yeah.
And so it comes through. It's really exciting. I mean, these incredible athletes. But we wrote about this one, probably the most like kind of famous event in the Tour de France, which was this race between one of the segments between Jacques Anquetil, who was the favorite to win the Tour de France. He'd won 4 Tour de France before. People described him, he was like a robot. He was just a machine, and he would make, on the time trials, he would just always crush the time trials. And he was racing against Raymond Poulidor, who was, they described him as the, the wholehearted son of the soil from, and he was kind of, this really passionate guy. And they were in this race in this segment called the Puy de Dôme, which is this incredibly steep, up and down, really challenging race. And what made this race this segment so distinctive is that the two of them raced unlike you normally see. So normally you see the riders, they go behind each other to save on the air drag and all that. Instead, these two raced shoulder to shoulder, literally like their shoulders ramming into each other for 10 kilometers up and down these hills. And then finally, Poulidor, this wholehearted son of the soil, pulls ahead and wins this leg of the Tour de France. Now, here's the kicker. Poulidor did not win that Tour de France. Anquetil did. Poulidor never won the Tour de France. He raced 14 times and did not come first. In fact, he got the nickname as the Eternal Second. But did people love Anquetil, who won the Tour de France? No, they didn't. They loved Poulidor. In fact, he was more like dissertations and papers and theses have been written about why do people love this guy who never wins, but they loved him. And I think the secret of it is near the end of his career, somebody criticized him and said, Poulidor, you weren't serious enough. And he responded by saying, maybe I wasn't, because I never woke up in the morning thinking about winning. I woke up in the morning thinking about how great it was to ride and how much I love to ride. And that spirit, that's an infinite player who's saying, I'm going to enjoy the thing. I'm going to enjoy the practice of it. And that just shone through. That's what people loved. And so, listen, I don't live in a cloud. I realize I have to do things that maybe I don't wake up in the morning and think, oh, I'm so lucky to do this. I'm going to do this exhausting 5 days, workshop or something like that. But when I can tweak it and say, how do I look at the angle of this that I could love? How do I go into this for the joy of the experience? Whatever it is that I can find in it, the joy, that shows through. And so I think this infinite player is something we can bring to so many aspects of our life.
Yeah, I love it. By the way, I'm an avid cyclist. I've got a poster of the Pyrenees in the background, and I'm going to be doing a 7-day stage race through the Alps next in 2 weeks. So I love that story, and I love that sort of idea of infinite game, because I'm already thinking. So just so many thoughts about that. One is there are people who they think, well, when I get that promotion or that thing or achieve that whatever, then everything will be great, and then that happens, and then I'm still, things are still kind of the same. That's kind of finite thinking, but I love that idea of, continuing the game. And similarly, I think there are probably people who, if they're finite players, they might not push themselves as much, right? Because they think, well, there's a chance here that this isn't going to work. So they might not go for things that there's a chance of failure. And I think probably anything worth doing is, involves a chance of, a reasonable chance of failing.
It's really true. And it's, if we're really honest, it's one of the dilemmas of life in a corporate environment, in the sense that a lot of times corporates will say they want innovation, but then they will punish, or innovation that maybe doesn't work out as you think. And I think a really finite view of that, if I'm honest, is to say, I won't take any risks because I have like one very narrow track to the top that I want. And it puts that narrow track at the top at risk. That's a very finite view of the world, versus if you really take the risk to do new and different things, it can open up all kinds of possibilities. And I think where we sometimes get stuck is we have this, what you're focused on is, how do I win this one game in front of me, which is my march up the ladder in this one corporation, whereas you don't realize how taking that risk could actually lead to other opportunities inside your company, other opportunities outside your company, other life paths that you might find more fulfilling. And if you think, oh, Nathan, this is really nice, I should say that in some of my other research on innovators, we've surveyed now over 16,000 executives, innovators, entrepreneurs. And what we can show you empirically is that those who are more willing to take risks, they get faster promotions, they get paid more, and they rise in the ranks faster. That, yes, the ability to execute is kind of bar for entry into like leadership ranks, but once you kind of get past that, the ability to think in new ways, to take risks, to intelligently, that actually is a greater predictor of your performance than your ability to get things done. So we kind of have, again, you can choose a finite way for sure, but it's going to be a lot more stressful along the way.
It also, I think, it leads to binary thinking, which I think you talk about, sort of either or. It's like, I need this thing or else my life is, ruined. And there's nothing like that, right? There's no one, there's always another chance, right? For the most part, unless you do something horrific. But, for the most part, there are, if something doesn't work out, there are other ways to move on from it afterwards, right? Which I do want to move to the other end of that axis for a moment and just talk about the sustain side, because what you're talking about, it doesn't lead to unicorns and rainbows and things like this. Like shit happens, right? And people go through stuff, and sometimes that's self-inflicted, and sometimes it's just it's completely something that happens out of the blue. And I'm sure there are people listening to this who are going through some difficult moments, and I'm just wondering if you could share a little bit of your insights around dealing with disappointments and setbacks, and when things just aren't working out, and what some of the tools in your books say about dealing with some of those things and moving, what the sustains part of the axis kind of looks like a bit. That'd be great.
Totally. I'd love to take that. To me, sustain, I like how you actually are jumping there, because sometimes we go kind of like that's the last thing. But it's actually not. It's something we need the whole time we're facing uncertainty. And it is in that axis of cognition. It's a mental thing, sometimes, most of all, because sustaining activities come when maybe you were facing something and you thought, okay, yes, I'm going to go for this. And then it just bifurcates, or it changes on you, or it goes wrong and you need to change. And it can feel devastating. And we need that reframing aspect of reframe again. A lot of times we encourage you, go back to those framing techniques that worked for you, that got you started in the first place. Revisit, why did you undertake this thing? And feel into what's still true about that. And sometimes for sustain, we do need to shift, and we need to let that thing go and move on. But what I love about the sustain section is there's 3 pillars within the sustain section, and they're all really important. The first one is emotional hygiene. And we discussed this idea that while we have had a physical hygiene for all of our lives, it really was something that at the turn of the century wasn't really known. People didn't realize, like, oh, if I wash my hands, I will not spread these germs or these diseases. So just like physical hygiene actually ended up doubling life expectancy, our emotional hygiene is something that's rather new, but it can be as simple as sitting with our emotion and becoming aware of why we feel that way, of really acknowledging and honoring the experience, the grief, the shame, and trying to clean that up like a wound, where you look at it and you say, oh my gosh, this needs a bandage and it needs time to heal. So with our emotions, we have several tools under that category of understanding that uncertainty will feel like a roller coaster, that there will be a wave of, you're on the top of the wave, you're riding, it's amazing, and then there is a valley. That happens. That has been proven time and time again. That is a natural part. There's never smooth sailing the whole time. The second pillar of sustain is reality check. And this is a more, again, it's a cognitive thing where you use framing again but to see it in the terms of, what have I learned? What do I still have to be grateful for? What about this might still work later? It's just not the right time. And so you have all of these frustration management frames to kind of really take a look at the situation. One of those tools is to look at the worst case scenario, to really feel into, because a lot of times with worst case scenario, it's so scary. It's like we're looking at it like a little kid watching a scary movie. We're aware that worst case is there. But if we really turned at it and looked at it and walked ourselves through it, Nathan, tell about how worst case scenario works for you.
Oh yeah, this is a good one. So would you actually, one of the tenets we engage in binary thinking, and that binary thinking is usually this huge looming possibility that everything's going to implode, and then the little teeny chance that it's going to be okay. And what innovators do to help themselves that's more productive is, number one, they think in terms of many possibilities, possible pathways, and probability of those pathways. So, and then the example for pandemic, I lose all my income, I'm freaking out, I'm going to go bankrupt. And first off, what I should do, and what I've learned to do from these innovators, is say, well, what are the many possible outcomes here? Bankrupt is one. Losing my job is one. And what's the probability of that? And actually, if you assigning probability to it, wasn't zero, but it wasn't as big as it was looming in my mind, right? So that's step one, to calm down. And then step two is this worst case scenario, which is a tool that psychologists use, but other fields use as well, which is we will obsess about the worst case scenario, but we'll leave it a shadowy threat. And it's so much bigger when it's a shadowy threat. When we actually thoughtfully unpack it. So what I did is I thoughtfully unpacked it, which was, okay, so what would happen if indeed the university folds, I lose my job, and we go bankrupt and all that? Well, is it true? It's true that I have some skills. There will always be some demand for some teaching. We could lose the apartment, and that, that would be sad. But, what if that forced us to move to maybe a different location, maybe a little bit more off the beaten path, a little more affordable? Gosh, that would be kind of quieter and nicer. And maybe, hey, we live in France. We could even maybe go live near the coast in France. And all just sound like, gee, maybe it would be nice to have a less stressful life, kind of take the dog on a walk near the coast. Suddenly the world almost became like a good plan, and now that's not always true, right? I want to acknowledge that there are worst cases that many of us face, which are...
Well, when they're life and death, if the worst case is this person might die, I mean, that is its own thing that needs to be, again, the emotional hygiene for that is going to be different than these ones that are, these things that if we lost, we'd still be alive and have our people. When it goes to the people level of losing someone, that's a way harder situation.
Yeah, I think what you're saying there is that we want to acknowledge...
don't want to minimize that.
Yeah, we want to acknowledge there are downsides, but we're all familiar with those. So what we're trying to find is what are the upsides. And, there are, we're not trying to come from a place of privileged ignorance here. I mean, one of our children had some very, very severe mental health issues as a result of the COVID crisis. So several manic episodes. He had to be hospitalized. And, last summer was a very hard summer because we spent so much time writing this book and had planned to have some downtime. And instead, we were just trying to keep him alive. I mean, he was so depressed. It was really, really dark period. And there were some things we could cancel, but there are other things we couldn't get our money back from. And one of them was we had booked a hotel down by the ocean. And so we were there at this hotel that was supposed to be like a relaxing thing with our son between us, with his black hoodie on and his high tops on in the burning sun, just utterly miserable. And by the way, Harvard had demanded that we revise the upside of uncertainty. So we're also now on our laptops with him. And for me, this was really hard. Like, this was not what I planned. I planned like a relaxing thing. And Susannah did this really beautiful job of reframing it. She said, everybody would like to have a happy summer or a relaxing summer. But how many people get to have what you call the triumphant summer, which is if we can shepherd this child through. Like, first off, we're lucky to have the resources to even spend time with him. And what would happen if we shepherded him through and let him know that he was loved and that we were there to support him? And it really became a different way of seeing it. And we were able to pull out the possibility out of that. Was it hard? For sure, but we stayed close as a couple. And then the funny thing is we did this summer, we did a makeup trip where we went to the same place. And when he found out about it, he's like, wait, you're not taking me this time? And, but I would say, I look back on that summer now and I'm like, oh my gosh, it was triumphant because, you know, teenagers are hard and teenage sons can be hard and teenage daughters as well. But this teenage son walked away from that summer and he came out of it. But he walked away with it, with the knowledge that his parents love him and will support him, even in his darkest places. And man, I'm so grateful. I'm so grateful that that's what we were able to pull out of that, because it was close for me. I'm an impatient person often. I could have just nuked that whole situation and made it horrible. But Susannah did this incredible rethinking of what that could be, and we pulled the possibility out of it.
I'd love to just go back to like the infinite game thing. I think that came into play for me because the infinite role there, I mean, I think Nathan's brain was like, the finite part was like, but I'm paying this money for this really cool place to be in this place where there are no kids and it's really relaxing. And it was like the gears were just like clicking around. And the infinite thing for me was kind of like, but this is where we are. And this is the role right now as his parent. We had no idea we were so out of our league with this. His psychiatrist was like, just put him inpatient. Like, I put him on too many things. He was on like 5. He was on 2 antipsychotics. And he had like such a horrible thing. And all the money, it was like, this is what, like, it made no sense. And yet the infinite thing was just like, just stay alert. Totally, we needed our own emotional hygiene. But what was triumphant to me, it sounds like that's so almost arrogant to say I was triumphant, but I mean it in the most quotidian way, which was we're breathing and he's breathing and we're on a teammate level thing. It's like I looked at Nathan like so many times while we were with this kid whose back was to this gorgeous Mediterranean Sea, not caring, not even refusing to listen to the music that had always given him comfort. But it was like something amazing. There was possibility because we were staying so serene. We were like, okay, and we were needing all of these sustain tools. And so coming back from reality check and worst case scenario to swirl into the last phase, which is magic, which sounds kooky, and we use that word on purpose because it's not Harry Potter and wands, and spells, but there is serendipity. There are flashes of brilliance and insight in the universe that are kind of waiting for us to see them and take hold of them. And what happened after that experience with our son at that place was we went into Provence. We had one night left. He really wasn't showing any change of anything.
Yeah, he was just staring at the wall.
And we had this dinner, like this really gastronomic cool dinner, and he seemed good enough to have his own meal at the other restaurant that was just anyway, at this long dinner.
He didn't want to sit through the long dinner.
So we're at this long dinner and we're feeling like, okay, we're going home back tomorrow. Like, I don't know, it's like holding a really hard yoga posture, like keep breathing. When's going to be a shift? And at one point, Nathan said, I'm going to go check on him over there. And we have a picture from that moment. Nathan went around to the other side. And here's this person who's been through so much suffering and so much bitterness. And he was at this table and he was eating this meal. And he had this glimmer of relief and peace on his face that was so palpable. And later he told us, it's like it was chicken and eggplant, but it was like food from heaven. It was like feeding his soul on a new level. And basically, I think he had gotten off enough of the medications and gotten on the right thing. So you could try to pinpoint what exactly it was. But the magic of it was that in that moment, he wanted to live. Like the food went into his body And maybe it was the cicadas chirping, like, we can't orchestrate when these moments will happen, but it was definitely out of our hands. It was definitely something that we will never be able to say, oh, that's why that happened. But it was a turning point for him that was so real. And he still will talk about, he's even said, maybe I should go back there. And Nathan sent an email to the team to say that meal was a moment, because we also need to encourage other people in their work. That can be a serendipity when we share our generosity of gratitude. Whatever you're doing, it spoke to my son. He wanted to live from your meal. And it sounds really cheesy, like a Disney movie, but it's real. Our bodies are creaturely, again, back to these comforts. They can wake us up in a moment. And when we remember magic in this way of insight is waiting for me, revelation might be just around that corner, a godsend might come from a human that I don't even know, from a stranger. When we don't forget that those things are possible, they're more likely to happen to us, because we'll be looking for them. We're going to be like, hey, universe, I'm ready. I really need something right now. And so that's a really important part. It's not just reality check and emotional hygiene. It's putting yourself in the situation where that could happen to you. You might need to go to a museum. You might need to pick up a literary work that people have been telling you to read forever. You might need to listen to a podcast that keeps jumping in your feed forward, because there are questions and conversations and people waiting to reach us so that we can continue on these uncertain journeys.
That's a wonderful story. Thank you for sharing that. There's a few reactions to it. I've heard similar things about it. Sometimes might be a very basic thing, like going to a museum or seeing a picture or whatever, something along those lines in those moments. But I also, one of the things I was thinking about as you were describing it is that I think what's really important around, I don't know if this is infinite game or finite thing or whatever, but I think when we're going through a difficult time, I think there's a danger that we can add to it because we attach lots of things out. Like we get into the sort of loop of, oh, this is going to happen and that's going to happen, and we attach we throw things into it because of our sort of worries. But sometimes just actually being just present with the situation, even however shitty that is, and just trying to deal with that situation and just I think there's a bit of letting go that you described there as well. Just deal with the reality of the situation and just kind of sit with it for a little while, and then things get better eventually. But what you don't want to do is chuck a bunch of other stuff on top of it and make it you can make things worse, right? And that goes for, I think, for any sort of difficult moment. And it could be a little thing like getting lost, right? You could just not stop and like ask for directions through to bigger things.
Yeah, you're making me think about, again, I want to come back to this, since we do live in times with a lot of uncertainty. There's a good chance that many folks listening to this are, again, we're talking these kind of heightened terms about possibility and uncertainty, but they are feeling like, I have way too much uncertainty in my life. I've been there. I've been that a hard decision where I can't make it, and there's a deadline to make it, and I'm so stressed out and I'm freaking out. And one of the principles we talked about in the prime section of that first aid cross for uncertainty, which is, again, how do you prepare for uncertainty, is this principle of uncertainty balancer. And it's this idea that actually it's a bit of a myth that like people have an infinite capacity for uncertainty. We all have limited capacity. And we learned this because when we interviewed a lot of innovators, they would say these really provocative things like, I love uncertainty, or I eat uncertainty for breakfast, or uncertainty is fuel for me. And that felt like, whoa, that is not what it is for me, And so, but what was curious is we didn't just stop there. We really pushed hard and dug deep. And what we discovered when we dug deeper is that these very same people who said these provocative phrases had created some remarkably unusual islands of certainty for themselves, what we could call uncertainty balancers. So, like, they would fly in the same seat of the same in the plane, or stay in the same hotel room every time, of the same hotel every time they went to a city. They would carry their breakfast. They would wear the same clothes. They would do. I mean, they had all these things that they had done to create these islands of stability for themselves. And some of the most powerful were relationships, you know. So one gentleman, Sam Yagan, who was like a serial entrepreneur, he was the CEO of Match.com when they self-disrupted themselves with Tinder, which is a very risky thing, uncertain thing to do. And when he said uncertainty's fuel for me. But when we pushed him hard, we said, well, tell us about your life and about your personal life. He's like, oh, it's true. I did marry my high school sweetheart, and all my friends are from junior high. And I purposely create a remarkable amount of stability in my personal life, given how much uncertainty and ambiguity I traffic in at work. And so I would just say, as a takeaway there is uncertainty balancer you were just talking about, is to like kind of cut all these threads to all the complexity and uncertainties in a given situation that sometimes we get ourselves stuck in, and literally be in the present moment and say, like, at this exact moment, what problem do I have? And I think back to when you talked about that, I thought about this really hard career decision I had to make, and I got so stuffed and I was freaking out, and Susannah would often encourage me to say, like, just be here at dinner right now, because you don't have to make any decision right now. And it kind of like that balancer can bring down the heat of the uncertainty you feel, and can give you the time to get some clarity inside of you that can't happen if you're just in that constant kind of tension of anxiety.
I love that. I also was thinking about, well, a number of things, but one of them as well was that I've spoken to lots of adventurers and people like that, and the amount of planning that they do. If they're trying to, so you're trying to do something like that's never been done before, the amount of sort of thinking stuff through, and we often just kind of think these are kind of reckless people, they just throw caution to the wind, but they actually sit down. And one guest I was thinking about actually that they sailed around the world for 2 years and with their family, and the amount of planning that the guy did was amazing. But I think you were also talking about something a little different here as well, in terms of sort of it's a mental practice. I think what you're describing as well, that having routines and rituals and being present, I guess is really the definition of priming in your framework.
Ben, if I could riff off the planning thing you just said.
Yeah.
So in the do arm of the first aid course, we talk about ways to take action to resolve uncertainty. One of the most important of those is experiments. We call it small steps, but it's to run these experiments. Now, I want to take what you just said about planning, and I want to paint two different pictures of planning. I was just in a big session with a bunch of academics who were talking about how entrepreneurs operate and all the theories of entrepreneurship, and it was a really interesting phrase, because this gentleman at Bocconi University, who's a friend and colleague, said, when we think about experiments, it's not just the experiments that we do in the physical world, where we go out and we say launch a product or launch an MVP or do something. There's also mental experiments. And so think of, when I hear what your adventures do, think of planning. You could treat it in one of two ways. One is I make a plan and I go execute doggedly on that plan, even though all the evidence is telling me that this isn't working, and then I wait until it blows up in my face and it's a big failure, which often happens in the entrepreneurial world and the corporate world, versus a view of planning, which is, what if I saw those plans as running many, many, many mental experiments, and then when I step into the unknown, I've run all these mental experiments and I compare it to how the experiment in real life is going, and I'm actually very well prepared to adjust course, to pivot, to take what I've learned and adjust. And so those are kind of two subtly but critically different views of planning. And my guess is that your gentleman and his family who sailed around the world for 2 years, so many things went different than they expected, but they were better able to deal with it because they weren't doggedly holding to their plan, and they'd run all these little mental experiments.
I'm conscious of time, but just wanted to pick up on something there as well. That a question for both of you is, when do you know that it's time to pivot? When do you know that you need to quit? Is maybe it's a word that I've been thinking about quite a lot. But when do you know that it's time to change course? How would you know that?
I think for whatever reason, it's coming to me back to that infinite player mode, because again, if you are trying to know it from the plan or like the finite role or like what's been handed down to you, then you might know. But if there's something inside of you that doesn't want to give up yet, it's because actually the infinite part of you, or the part of you that still feels like, no, there's still something here for me, it won't really, that will be a striding between those two. And so I think when you know to pivot is you check in with yourself. It really is a quiet awareness of, I am forcing this machinery so much. We talk about don't force machinery. Don't force because of your need for control. That can look like, we also called it premature certainty, where you pick something just because you are so sick of uncertainty, you'd rather have some certainty and just go down that path, even though you see it, even though you're kind of like, this is so boring, I hate this, but I'll do it because I can't stand the not knowing. It's the same thing to me with a pivot or needing to shift. I believe we are wired to feel intuitively, even people that feel like, no, I don't have intuition. I believe we all do. And we need to just start listening to it and let that come up.
Maybe I'll add to that and say that there's a difference between an obstacle and a signal to change. And for those who are listening who are maybe a little bit more kind of, cognitive in nature or thinking oriented, in the entrepreneurial world, we think about the difference between, like, if you're an entrepreneur and you go out and you're running an experiment, how do you know when to pivot? Well, it's not the first person you talk to who says, this, I don't want this doesn't work. That's like a premature signal. What you have to do is you have to go out and you have to spend enough time kind of beating around the bushes that you start to hear the themes and you start to hear what is a signal to keep going versus a signal to change. And so to be very specific, like if we think about qualitative research terms, we often think about that you need at least 8 to 20 interactions to start even hearing the same theme over and over. So number one, I would say, start to listen for themes. And sometimes the theme can be, this might work, but it might not. And maybe you should think about a different direction, because what pivoting is taking what you've learned and building on it. It's not just jumping to somewhere new. And so I think if you combine what Susannah said, which is you have an intuitive sense that this is an obstacle versus this is a signal to change. And you take what I've said, which is you're going out, you're getting enough signals from whatever you're trying to do that you start to hear themes. You can start to hear, oh, there might be another possibility over here that's a little different than I expected. Versus you might say, no, there are times when people say, this is what I really believe in, and I'm going to push through this obstacle anyway. And I can, for sake of time, I won't share the stories, but there are many examples. And I think it comes down to intuition and logic and hearing the difference between an obstacle measured against what you believe to be true, what knowledge you already have, versus a signal to change that maybe it's not the right time, and so I should put on pause, or maybe I need to change direction.
Okay, that's great. And I guess lastly, just to wrap up, I think we went round, we looked at all the extremes of your axes, but maybe just finally for someone who's listening to this who wants to maybe take a step in the direction of the upside of uncertainty, something maybe from the do side of the axis that someone could consider doing, what would you leave them with?
Well, I think in some ways what Nathan was just talking about was part of the doing axis, which is this idea of cognitive flexibility, of being able to, and the planning part, like doing the work to prepare yourself for it. But then when you start going, trusting yourself, but the attitude of wisdom piece is that you really hold that you could be wrong and that you're going to need to shift. So when we're doing things under uncertainty, we want to do all that priming stuff and then get out there and do these experiments. So that's the small steps actually is under the do section. Be willing to pivot and learn. And like you said, is an obstacle the sign of you're done and give up? Or is it, no, this still needs to be pushed through, just change it slightly. And one of the tools that goes along with that is this idea of that you might need to take 10,000 shots. And it comes from an actor we met who was telling us about for every role he gets, he might have tried 100 roles. He might have done 100 auditions, and it just blew us away because we often do one or two things and then think, oh, I'm not good at this. And this actor shared, well, don't you know, in National Geographic photographers, they would send them on assignment and say, okay, here's 10,000 frames of film. And we have to remember, this is expensive film that was going to need to be developed in dark rooms. It wasn't just these digital instantaneous photos. And Nathan went home and thought, was it 10,000? And he looked it up and it was more like 20 to 40 or something.
40 to 60,000 frames to get eight photos that would appear in the magazine. And it just it just shocked me because, again, so many of us try one time and then we're like, oh, never mind. And here this actor will try 100 times to get one role. And these photographers will take 50, 60,000 shots to get those 8 or 10 shots to appear in the magazine.
So really the doing axis of these tools is really about, again, being really aware that it's going to be needing to be sustained the whole time because it's not going to go as you thought. So keep coming back to your reframe of why you're doing it. See where you need to shift. See where you can be more cognitively flexible, where you're being too rigid and trying to force what you thought was going to be the right answer. And do it with this idea, maybe just a little sprinkling on the top. Our favorite idea actually from that is the tool of unlocking and activating what's already within the thing itself. And it's very abstract, but it's really a beautiful idea that takes some of the pressure off, because a lot of times with uncertainty, we think it's all up to me to make this thing happen. I have to bring all the ingredients. And the tool of activating and unlocking is basically the opposite of managing. And business has always been talked about as a management science. But when we come to an issue, whether it's relationship, work, something that's a problem or a scenario that we need to unpack, there is an essence of that thing waiting to come to life. And it could be, like Nathan said with John O'Donohue, there's probably 7,000 things it could be, and so many of them would be really awesome. And it takes the pressure off. What am I here? How can I unlock whatever this thing is? And trusting yourself that you have something to offer. And that's back to reframe. Going rogue on your self-doubt, like really showing up, believing that you have something to add. So
much good stuff there. I feel like I could keep talking to you guys for hours, but I know that we need to wrap it up. But that's, I think, a lovely place to do that. Before we go, I know that you, in addition to the book, there's a site and you've got things like workshops and stuff like that. So just for my listeners who have really enjoyed this, I'm sure there are many who will get a lot out of it, but where can people follow you and maybe get involved in some of the things that you're doing?
Yeah, so the book is called The Upside of Uncertainty and can get it pretty much anywhere, but the website is also called The Upside of Uncertainty. Or for some people, there's another one called Uncertainty Possibility. Again, uncertainty, possibility, two sides of the same coin. Either one will take you to the same place. And there we talk about all the tools because we try to make it accessible to folks, not just, having to buy the book. And then, we're working on an asynchronous course because we really try to make these tools practical, tangible. And so there's these reflection exercises to help you really think through each one. And so that'll be part of the asynchronous course. And then, of course, community. We're not the final voices on this, so we want people to be able to share their experiences, share their wisdom. You have lots of insight and wisdom about that. And so a place where people can kind of hook up with others to kind of encourage themselves in their journey. So it's the upsideofuncertainty.com or uncertaintypossibility.com.
Wonderful. This is great. I really enjoyed this conversation. I'm sure that my listeners will enjoy it as well. Thank you both. Really, once again, I really appreciate you taking the time to speak to my audience, and I wish you all the best, and I look forward to following and applying some of these tools myself.
Thanks, Ben.
Thank you, Ben.